Check, check. Can everybody hear me? All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Great to see such a good turnout. We also had a great book signing event earlier, so it's been a good visit for Chris so far. I'm Gail Fulton, Director of the School of Landscape Architecture, for those of you that don't know me yet. I think this is the third in our lecture series. Is that right, Mark? Fourth? Third? Yeah. And I think there's two more, right? Rana Abudaya and Alistair Wiper. And then also another thing to put on your calendars is the Regional Globalism Symposium, which I believe is November 4th. 3rd. I think it got changed. Huh? Oh, right. And Ryan Jones is a Atrium talk, correct? Yeah. So all those things will be emailed to you repeatedly prior to them happening. Okay, so of course, it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Chris Reed. I got to thinking about, it seems a little weird for me to be at this point in my career, but I've been following Chris's work for a long time. So I got turned on to it as I was getting out of grad school, I believe. Landscape urbanism was much of what people were talking about at that time. Stoss LU started in 2000. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you had a self-programmed Flash website originally. Does that sound about right? Yeah, which was also pretty interesting to me. Most of you will have no idea why that's of any interest. They're not around anymore, though. But along those lines, we've actually interacted a lot. I first got introduced to Chris through a colleague of ours at Penn State. We were up in Boston touring offices. And then subsequently, we did small exhibits at Penn State. And then when I was at the University of Illinois, Chris and I interacted again. We ended up building full-scale mock-ups of, I believe, the Fox River project in a gallery there. And then, of course, last spring we had a small exhibit out here. And I've always appreciated working with Chris because he's always been really generous with his time and the firm's time, I think in regards to this kind of pedagogical mission that we have. And so, again, really appreciate that on a personal level, knowing that he's obviously a very busy person. And so some of what keeps him busy, he leads the design and content development of each Stoss project, and so is simultaneously a designer, researcher, strategist, teacher, and advisor who is recognized internationally as a leading voice in the transformation of landscapes and cities. He is also one of the most important voices in the conversation around landscape urbanism, landscape infrastructure, and more recently, his work, I think, has shifted in a large way towards urban ecology, landscape and urban ecologies. And I think all of these conversations have significantly impacted landscape architecture, certainly, and to a lesser degree, I would say, architecture. Or maybe it had an impact on architecture for a while and is now kind of fading out, I'm not sure. In addition to his leadership of Stoss, Chris is also a professor in practice of landscape architecture and co-director of the MDes program at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And as he states, he and the firm's commitment to teaching is not only a way to develop the next generation of landscape architects, but also keeps Stoss on a constant quest for new ways of seeing, thinking, and doing. And we had the good fortune to have Chris in Scotty and I's studio for a discussion of the work today, which was very interesting. He's also taught beyond the GSD at UPenn School of Design, University of Toronto, and the University of Virginia, among others. He and the firm have received multiple awards over the years, including the 2012 Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Landscape Architecture, the Topos International Landscape Award, and a 2019 Merit Award from the Boston Society of Landscape Architects for their Moakley Park Vision Plan, and many more. I'm just kind of cherry-picking some of the stuff out of his very lengthy CV. Chris's published works include Mise en Scene, which is the book that we were selling today, which he co-authored with photojournalist Mike Bellamy in 2021. Projective Ecologies, which I know has been on the desktop of many of our students over the years. which he co-edited along with Nina Marie Lister in 2014, as well as other important essays. Brad was talking about public works practice and how that's part of his syllabus in one of his classes just the other day. That appeared in the Landscape Urbanism Reader. The Agency of Ecology, which was published in the book Ecological Urbanism, and more recently, Generative Modeling and the Making of Landscape, which was in the edited volume by Brad Cantrell called Codify. Again, there are many more essays and articles appearing in a wide range of venues over the years, such as Topos, Places Journal, and 306090, and I encourage you, if you haven't read work by Chris, to check it out. I think Stoss's approach is a compelling one for landscape architecture, in that it ranges from the built to the visionary and from the pragmatic to the experimental. Early works, such as City Deck in Green Bay, Wisconsin, helped advance the conversation of landscape as critical public infrastructure. Other smaller scale projects like Safe Zone at the Matee Garden Competition in Canada, Stockpile, which is piles of rock, right, and soil, and Sunflowered, which is a largely sunflower-based phytoremediation project. All of these are on his website. I encourage you to go check out the projects that are there. But all of these, those last three projects, especially Matee, Stockpile, and Sunflowered, they experiment with relatively low-cost installations, exploring materiality and performance. But one of the things I really appreciate about Stoss's work is there's always an eye and a consideration for the importance of the aesthetic. More recent works, which have probably gotten more press, include the beautifully designed and detailed Gerstacker Grove on the campus of the University of Michigan, which some of you may have visited, and resiliency planning for the city of Boston through their Moakley Park project. And so taken together, all of these works, the built, the planned, the published, the pedagogical, convincingly demonstrate, in my opinion, the importance of working across a range of territories for a creative practice. And so please join me in welcoming Chris Reed.
All right. Good evening. Good to see you all. Thanks to Gail for that lovely and thoughtful introduction. It's important to have good colleagues. Gail's one of those. It's important that these colleagues go between practice and academia, and that while we find opportunities to collaborate, as Gail has elaborated on, it's also a great opportunity to be challenged, to be thoughtful, for us to get feedback from what's happening in schools, and for us constantly to be thinking ahead and pushing. So Gail's one of the folks that for a long time has been doing this, and I very much appreciate that. I also want to thank Dean Young, who's over here. Jason and I likewise go back a little ways as well. It's interesting to see actually so many familiar faces, colleagues, former students who are now colleagues as well, doing so well with Scotty and Andrew here. Pretty amazing in that sense. And it's been a really nice couple days. So thank you all for your generosity, for hosting me, for your continued interest. Scotty showed me around, sort of kept me on time today. That wasn't your fault, that was mine. And I had a nice dinner last night. I also spent some time with the students today, which was really nice. For the folks who hosted me at lunch, it was great. For the folks who allowed me to come into the studio and chat with you and see some work in progress. I know sometimes you kind of feel like, is this stuff ready for prime time yet? That's fine. It's always just fine to have good conversation about good work. So I really appreciate that. And to all of you who showed up and bought the book, I mean, that was just stunning. In a lot of ways. Gail didn't expect it, I didn't expect it. And we have promised that Gail will send an email. We will make more books available to you. I will sign them at my office if you want one, and we'll send them on. So just let Gail know. So appreciate that. Also appreciate, I was supposed to be here sometime last spring. American Airlines and the folks at DCA Airport conspired against that. Gail persisted, and had me back. So you got Mike Bellamy, my collaborator on the book project in the spring, and now you get me talking about something slightly different, so super bonus points all around. Things are complicated these days, right? The world around us is pretty complicated. In a lot of ways, the increasingly complex web of environmental, social, political, and cultural dynamics impacting global cities and extended landscapes demand responses that are anticipatory, multivariate, inclusive, and adaptable. As designers, I think we must think and act expansively, ambitiously, yet also realistically, acknowledging that our work typically happens at discrete moments in time, while the life of the spaces and places we imagine will continue to evolve and frankly have been evolving for eons. In this context, the idea of staging, setting up, supporting, curating, catalyzing is essential. Conceptually and operationally, staging for us opens up possibilities for how we negotiate between the things we make and do and the various ways that time, climatic and environmental processes, social and racial dynamics, social life and everyday activities, economics, regulatory systems, policies, politics will continue to impact and remake the contexts and performances of our work. This talk will frame how we at Stoss tackled these challenges. We'll actually look back at a lot of the projects that Gail mentioned, look back at the thinking behind those projects. But for us, the firm has always been an ideas-based strategic design practice, very much caught up in the pursuit of critical social, cultural, and environmental agendas, but also committed to application and implementation, and the learning from that filtered back into how we conceptualize the work that we do. The talk will parallel a recent project, the Mise en Scène book project, collaboration with photojournalist Mike Bellamy, though I've distinguished this talk from doing strictly a book talk. The book is not about foregrounding the work, but rather it's about communicating to broader audiences the kind of issues that are in play in cities across America today and around the world. It's a conversation about what we as designers encounter in our everyday work lives, the lives and situations depicted in many of the photographs you'll see here today that you see in the book, set the stage for the work we do in cities, just as our designs and projects set up new and altered conditions. I've broken the talk into 3 thematic sections. The first called Accommodating Difference, which really deals with fabrication at the human scale, the scale of the human body. Second, on reinaugurating dynamics, how we interact, how sites interact with environmental processes, and how these ideas can be extended to social space. And third, cultivating the city, how broader ideas taken together can start to contribute to landscape-based, performance-driven ideas of urbanism. And so first, accommodating difference. Here, this is an idea born from an interest in human behavior, recognizing difference in human bodies, difference in our moods as we encounter public space, as we simply do what we do, different desires for sitting and setting and context and degree of sociability. It also is born from an interest in our innate tendencies to reappropriate the world in front of us, to encounter it as it is, as the sentient, curious creatures that we are, to simply explore and use it as it comes to us. These folks are not misusing the benches and tables in front of them. They're simply appropriating it for use other than that for which it was initially conceived. That's kind of what we do all the time, whether we sit on a log in the forest, sit back against a tree, or just make our way in the world. Making do is something that folks do a lot. The folks on the left are doing this because they have to, because they've been given circumstances without access to simple things like trees and recreation. The ladies on the right are doing it because they choose to. They could sit in the cafe, they could sit in the sidewalk cafe, and yet they've chosen to wiggle their way in between these two cars because that's the place that's most comfortable for them at the moment. We want to kind of play into this. We want to acknowledge it and realize that there are ways in which we too can take these on. Skateboarders, of course, are really good at appropriating the urban environment for their own purposes. Even folks like him, irrespective of the fact that there's practically a major highway going by, he's just made his way in the world and figured out where he wants to be to do what he wants to do on that particular day. Now, kids are really good at this. I mean, my own kids, as they would, encounter a sidewalk and move and hop from utility cover to utility cover. They have no idea what the intent of those things are. They're just simply exploring. And this is one of the things that we wanted to do in the Safe Zone project that Gail mentioned. This is a garden installation in Grammatique, Quebec. And the idea here was simply to create a surface, allow people to explore it, and allow for some interaction with it, and then to record the ways in which they did use it. So it was a material study, simple poured in place rubber, spread across an undulating terrain, and then we used the code that goes along with playground design. The higher the fall, the thicker the padding of the subsurface. And what that does is you begin to create a topography that looks like this, is it creates different levels of resistance as you're moving through the space. The lower parts are squishier, the higher parts aren't so squishy. And so as kids start to run through that, the change in footfall will actually cause them to tumble one on top of the other. Kids were really good at just making up games within this environment. The garden curator came up to me at the installation and said, "Oh, this is a little much, isn't it? It's a little harsh." It wasn't didactic as many of their other installations were. And I said, just give it a moment, right? Let people in, see what happens. And the construction supervisor started taking photographs and just recording all the different ways people would engage with that garden in ways that they didn't physically and socially engage with other spaces. And so it was a great experiment for us just in human behavior to see how people deal when they encounter things that are unfamiliar and are not scripted out for them. These issues find their place in a number of projects where we cross this interest with processes of making across both digital and analog design. Here there's an emphasis on replicability and variation, on intensification at moments, and on different formal expressions, although all with a common set of interests. At Erie Street Plaza, there was an obsession here with the systematic, the idea that multiple parts can be combined in infinite ways to produce different opportunities for sitting, right? Very, very simple. But in a way that was flexible, that was a bit open-ended, that could be deployed differentially across the site in ways that animated surfaces or fields to create variation, intensification, choice, right? Do you want to sit alone or in a group? Do you want to sit in the sun or in the shade? The idea that a series of replicable parts could help to do this. In this one, these were simple analog explorations tuned to regional craft. Here we were working with a regional canoe manufacturer and using fiberglass, simply as a very cheap way of getting a seating element and a lighting element simultaneously, right? But doing something that had a little bit of interest, that gave a little bit of identity to the space, but produced a set of conditions that invited people in. At the city deck a little further north in Wisconsin, we began to explore this through the use of wood, looking at individual and collective spaces, infrastructural and regional spaces, scalar variation, and intensified edges. You can see here again an expanded catalog of seating elements different ways that surface of wood could be folded in and out to accommodate people. This is the one that we were building full-scale mock-ups. And actually, when we did this originally, we were using plywood in the office. I came home one day from a trip, and there were 2 interns on the floor screwing pieces of wood together, simply because we wanted to test not which of the sizes and angles would best fit every body, but which combination might collectively fit a number of different types of our bodies in the office. And so this was a really nice exploration to do that, and you can begin to see the different modules that we created that were then, again, deployed along this riverfront, using, in this case, a material taken from that region and its history of logging and its use of wood within very simple riverfront and lakefront environments, just with a little bit of a twist. And so here, this idea of systematized folded surfaces combined with regional craft and the skills available to us with northern Wisconsin carpenters allowed us to create the sense of variability and scale along the city edge. At Harvard, here we began to really integrate design and fabrication processes, digital design and fabrication processes, looking at deployments across what we would consider generative fields, right? The idea of a number of different parts shaped where we could now take different sitting profiles and essentially loft them together to create new forms of a public collective bench. Again, that allowed for variation of deployment, and allowed for inhabitation in any way that people were interested. Here, too, we were interested in the open-ended nature of this. We had a long battle with the administrators at the university about, couldn't we just make a regular bench? And we kept saying, no, we draw them with people lying on them and playing on them. And they're like, oh, nobody's going to do it. And the day they unwrapped it, I got a call from one of them saying, oh my God, they're doing what you drew, right? It's amazing. It's like, we didn't invent people, right? We just watched how they use things. And you begin to see in an image like that 3 or 4 different ways that people are beginning to occupy these things, right? And particularly in public environments, how can we, when you're thinking about kids, how can you create playful environments, right, within the public realm that aren't just a playground? I think this is as important as thinking about the full range of ages and the range of people that we're dealing with. Sometimes this can be quite simple. So that's a private university giving us a lot of budget to do some interesting work. This is a public high school in Los Angeles where we can do similar things with more modest means. Just by turning the bench one way or the other and allowing it to be deployed in straight runs or bent runs, we begin to get at the same level of diversity and variability in ways that encourage people to socialize. And then finally at Gearstacker Grove, University of Michigan, here we're starting to explore a system or catalog of seat wall, bench, and curb units that can be arranged and deployed interchangeably for a variety of conditions across the site. Here we begin to create different variations from an elevational perspective, but also from a plan perspective as well. The emphasis here is on smoothness, on seriality, on multiplicity, and variation. And in some ways is a marriage of some of the conceptual thinking with techniques of generation and making. All of this is very much rooted in ideas of sociability and flexibility, the ways in which we accommodate difference, and the ways in which we support or instigate what we might call social ecologies of a place. I'm going to revisit each of these projects in a different way as we go through the talk tonight. But in all of this, the idea is to be less deterministic, more open-ended, affording of choice and difference and differentiation. All right, second, reinaugurating dynamics. The science of ecology tells us that the world around us is always in a state of change, interaction, of dynamic interrelations between organisms and the environment, and by extension, between and among humans and non-humans, environmental processes, and the material stuff of the earth. So the question here is, how is it that we recognize that our sites, our projects, the cities and spaces we work in and with are already in a state of motion with multiple histories and stories and processes in play, even if they may be momentarily muted, erased, or buried? How do we activate the latencies of a place in search of new integrated relationships, new dynamic futures? The Stockpile Project, it's actually amazing. Gail was talking about this last night. He was referring to a number of these very early projects for us, but projects that were seminal in many ways in developing the thinking behind the office, and it's why I kind of turned to them before knowing that Gail was going to mention them as predecessors to each of these pieces. This project, really simple. We had 3 days to conceive, design, and implement it. This is when one dean talks to another at Harvard, and they get a plan together, and I'm the last guy that gets the call after they've all planned it out. And it's like, what do we do? And it needs to be done within 3 days. And we said, great, let's bring in some trucks and dump some stuff, and then we'll go from there. And the idea here is to simply choose very carefully different stockpiles of materials that are commonly used within the landscape, to set them up in relationship to one another, and then simply to allow environmental processes to act themselves out across this landscape over time. Here you see it as installation and as the drawing. Here you see it again at installation on the left, and what it started to look like over time. Where the project itself started to record change within the environment because of the way certain of these materials would start to settle and slump and respond to creatures and sometimes a drunk student making their way through the environment. And so it became a really interesting way to simply test how is it that we record change and process within a project like this. So at the Erie Street Plaza project, now you see the bigger context that we're working with on the edge of the lake at a confluence of rivers, right at the heart of the industrial port. Here we were interested in re-inaugurating hydrologic and environmental processes that had previously been buried by infrastructure in industry. It was a very simple manipulation of the ground surface, a folding of the surface, in ways that started to re-inaugurate hydrologic cycles. On the one hand, rainwater would seep into the ground, but as rainwater increased, overland flow would start to produce puddling on the lower areas, which would allow us simply to re-inaugurate or reinstall a native marsh that all of this infrastructure and industry had once displaced. We also cut holes, cut slots in the riverfront bulkhead wall in order to allow water back into the site in very moderated ways, giving water space within the city, but more importantly, beginning to help visualize, make visual the kind of ecological and environmental changes that were indeed going on within the greater environment, but just didn't have visibility at that place. And so what we got was this incredible wetland that was quite dynamic, that changes quite dramatically through the seasons, and occasionally these flooding events, which makes people start to begin to think about the broader environment, and frankly allows folks like him to get better and healthier catches as they're fishing along the riverfront. Gearstacker Grove at the University of Michigan, again, larger scale. Here we're rethinking the traditional college campus quadrangle as simply a setting for college buildings and a space for circulation and image making, right? We're starting to think about the various functions that a space like this can take on, and the various ways it can better serve the student and academic community that's around it. This project really started with the need to retain 95% of the stormwater on site. And to do that, we deployed 5 stormwater gardens, infiltration gardens across the site. But then we quickly learned that the soil here was pretty crappy. It was very clay soil. And so in order to do this, we had to create some pretty big gardens in order to hold the water so it would very slowly infiltrate into the ground. That gave us a really nice opportunity to do a large-scale cut and fill operation, and actually to make these gardens something more than a rain garden, but something that was really spatial and could be experiential as well. But we also wanted to connect sustainability to technology and really the way in which people experience this place. So you can see these light rods within the gardens. Those light rods would glow normally, but as rainwater increased and the water levels started to fill up, those light rods would begin to flicker. And the more intense the rain, the more intensely those light rods would flicker. So the more miserable it was out, the quicker you wanted to kind of run through that space, the more the light was kind of beckoning you to slow down and pay attention a little bit, right? And so how in a project like this, how can we use simple technology to connect people to the world around them, right? In a way that kind of reveals things that are already happening within the environment that we might not be paying attention to. All of these projects are very much intended to catalyze hydrologic and ecological processes within the context of a social space, to initiate succession and adaptation, particularly in projects like Erie Street Plaza. But I believe these ideas of complex adaptive systems ecology, where healthy ecosystems mean places that are always in a state of change, where diversity and variability, adaptability and resilience are foregrounded, I think these ideas can be applied to social spaces as well, right? How is it that you can take those qualities of diversity, flexibility, and variability, bring them into social spaces, and allow those ideas to begin to create lively spaces that have a kind of ongoing life of their own? How can these places, like at the Plaza at Harvard, beyond the scale of the bench, beyond the scale of the human body, be open to both anticipated changes and unanticipated uses and futures? How is it that projects like this can encourage appropriation, can encourage spontaneity, and create healthier social ecologies simply by the way in which the ground is laid out, the ground is scripted or infused with a set of hidden infrastructures to support a series of activities that just simply play themselves out of their own volition. This space was very carefully designed to accommodate a full range of different activities. And again, some of these are ones we could script out with the client. Others were simply invented after the fact, right? And so how is it that the life of spaces like this can be set up so that when you walk away, you've built into it a kind of flexibility and accessibility that allows others to begin to take it over, to make it theirs, and to begin to reinvent the futures of that place as time goes on. At the city and regional scale, things get even more complicated, and we start to layer these strategies and also begin to take on other issues. The tensions between societal, racial, and environmental advancement and retreat, the battle for the hearts and minds of people sometimes continue to play out in so many of today's public discussions, especially around new development, open space, and planning in cities. How do we take on the most pressing climatic and environmental challenges out there? How do we deal with questions of who we design for and who we design with? How can a diversity of voices and cultures imprint themselves on the design process, on the way in which we program and design spaces? This is where broader societal questions and battles, very much in play in the world at large, can help to inform and infuse our work. Now, interestingly enough, when parks were invented in America in the late 19th century, that effort to make parks grew out of social reform efforts at the time, right? Folks thinking about the health of cities and the health of people living in cities were very much at the forefront of people pushing for what became parks and open spaces, and what eventually ended up in folks like Frederick Law Olmsted designing some of the world's most famous parks. In Boston, it was photographers like Louis Wicks Hines exposing the everyday lives of kids. These are kids in a dump picking garbage, right? And beginning to use that as a way to begin to advocate for clean water, clean air, and parks where people could escape from the everyday conditions of the industrial city. Really interesting to me, too, is the way these park systems, this is again Boston, integrated so many kinds of infrastructure within the project, right? On the lower left, you can see the amount of excavation and work going into the making of these spaces. They were certainly parks, and they were there for recreation and for habitat development, but they were flood control. They integrated light rail very early on, public mobility, and they also were inscribed by parkways, which connected new parts of the city to old and inscribed new neighborhoods. And so in all these ways, these were social reform efforts, right, brought by a number of people advocating for a new kind of urbanism and a new way of living within the city. And these were projects that were city projects, not just projects of landscape. And so in that way, it's this complex set of conditions which we began to be quite interested in as we founded the firm. How is it that landscape can reinfuse the bigger project of the city and the bigger urbanistic project as we begin to go forward and take on some of these issues that are becoming increasingly complex? And so some of the early work, this was a lovely little competition on the lakefront in Toronto, where we started with the idea of how do you reconstitute a river environment, and how is it that that reconstituted river environment could give rise to new ecologically situated neighborhoods across an urban district? Or in the city of Dallas, how is it that the rethinking and remaking of wastelands of infrastructure and stormwater detention might be the starting point for reimagining different ways that landscape and water-based landscapes can begin to infuse the city and create new kinds of lively neighborhoods. We've been working on these city projects from very early on. As Gail mentioned, City Deck was one of the earliest ones in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Here we were very much interested in the everyday and working qualities of that place and of the people that were there. There's a modesty to folks in the upper Midwest. We wanted to support and extend that modesty. We also love these people. I'm used to doing public meetings in Boston and places where people are really good at going to public meetings and yelling at you. In Wisconsin, the first time we presented this project, everybody in the room got up and stood up and clapped for us. And I've got to say, I want to go back there a lot, right? It's so nice. And it's just nice to, I mean, you know, it's good on the ego, but it's nice to have a bunch of people you can actually have a conversation with as well. And so this project at the city scale was really important in beginning a transformation process for the entire downtown. taking it from back doors in an industrial waterfront to really what's become the front porch of the city on the Fox River, its most treasured natural resource. But here, all that folding also integrated a very serious flood control measure for protecting that city. This is prior to all the talk about climate change and its impacts. How is it that we might integrate simple flood control along this riverfront and design the elevations of that landscape to support not only the kind of social uses we were talking about, but to occasionally be fully inhabited by water, thereby protecting some of the downtown assets. And so this idea of a variable, flexible space that really dealt with some of these bigger processes and also gave life to these kinds of activities was really important. At Moakley Park in Boston, it's one of the projects that we're dealing with that really take on the tensions between growth and development, an incredible waterfront city, but a city prone to climate change, sea level rise, and dealing with a whole series of challenges around social and racial equity. How are investments made? Where are investments made? And how do they begin to deal with conditions like this on the right, where sea level rise is already overtopping the banks around the edges of the city, and increased frequency of stormwater, rising groundwater tables are making drier spaces more perennially wet and unusable. Unusable for anybody but Canadian geese in the winter. Project like Moakley Park starts to take on the complex layering of infrastructural, urban, demographic, and racial issues that are in play. Here's an overview. You can see that oddly shaped site in the middle. You can begin to understand here the sea level rise levels, 21 inches, 9 inches sea level rise. When that happens, the entry paths into the city. You can begin to understand with the T and other highway systems how much infrastructure will be flooded from a couple different angles here, the role that the park will play in that. What you don't see is the fact that on the left-hand side where it says Columbia Road and on the north side of the park, there are two public housing developments for low-income, racially diverse people in the city. The folks who live right across the street are among the poorest, most racially diverse in the entire city. And so there's this convergence of issues in play in the project. Those folks who live across the street can't get to the park right now because of the overscaled roadways. The space is underutilized. It's just a bunch of flat ball fields that aren't well used. There's a lot of leftover unintentional space, and you can begin to see the flooding that happens on a regular basis now, at least from stormwater, and eventually what will happen from increased sea level. And so you have this convergence of issues. It's not a good community park, it's not a good destination park, and it's a main entryway for some of the climate crisis as it begins to impact the city over the coming years. It's also very much a struggle between groups and ethnicities. The guy on the right, I can hear him screaming. He's a Southie guy. He talks to us all the time. And yet it's the folks on the right-hand side that are far more impacted by everything that we're going to do within the park, both from a climate standpoint, but also from kind of social, recreational standpoint as well. So how is it that we begin to develop a park program that can address some of the climate issues, but also deal with the multiple publics that we're trying to deal with here? We do a lot of work like this, where we very seriously reach out to community members and stakeholders, get them to help us think through the issues. What are your basic needs? We often think it's one thing and they tell us, no, it's actually something else. We thought this was a park that was about climate change and sea level rise, and the first thing the sports guys told us was, no, we can't use the fields now because of the stormwater. Stormwater has nowhere to go, right? On the other hand, the folks living across the street said, there's nothing here for us, right? 60-acre park, our kids don't use it. We're not invited in. There's no program for them. Because of that, the park's underused. It's a site of illicit activity, drugs, needles, those sorts of things, right? So how is it that you begin to take on all these issues through the work? As of a year ago, we had touched base with about 22,000 people, which is pretty good. We're continuing those outreach efforts. And the question here is, how is it that that effort can begin to inform the way we program, but how is it that events and activities like this can also open people up to the idea of other kinds of activities being programmed into a place like this. So this was called Moakley Day. It was a day where we simply partnered with a number of organizations, got people out there that hadn't before used the park, closed down the roadway between the park and the beach, even had a couple in their bathing suits cross the road, which had never happened before because we had a beer garden in the park to begin to mix people and activities, right? So how is it that we can use some of the pre-design activation on the site and the ways we engage people to begin to inform ultimately what's going to come and ways to begin to build momentum in a place like this. A bit more of an overview of how we then recorded all that input and essentially used it to make an argument for the diversity of program that we were putting into the park that was different than just listening to the loudest voices that came to the most meetings, right? With this, we could say, no, there's actually demand for a much broader array of program, which would serve a much broader constituency, a bigger diversity of people, which would enrich the park, allow it to be a great community park on the one hand, but also a great sports park and a great destination park for people across the city. Various pieces of this, the edge condition was really designed as a linear community park with promenades and walking paths and running paths and spaces that were designed for different community groups. Big sports rooms in the center of the park to carry on that tradition of it being a sport park. The creation of other kinds of active gardens on the edges of those sport rooms to attract new populations into the park. And then looking at a waterfront landscape where flood control was embedded into the landscape itself, and so that spaces like this could perform both for people and also begin to contain some of the bigger storm events. It also gave us the opportunity to create new forms of park on the waterfront, this coastal park that really plays off some of the regional ecologies and sensations. Here you can see a performance of that. So how is it that a project like this can take on multiple agendas simultaneously and begin to rethink relationships within the broader city? In other instances, we've had the opportunity to go into places like Detroit and St. Louis to begin to head on tackle problems of social and racial inequity. How is it that we might begin to give value to the energies of people already in place, particularly looking at traditions of music and art and food and sociability that are already thriving and building on and around those. In Detroit, we had the opportunity through the Detroit Future City Project to begin to invent new forms of landscape-based urbanism that gave value to social, cultural, and environmental landscapes that were different than what normative economic development looked like. These were landscapes and urban fabrics that were rooted in things that were already going on the ground, but were suddenly given value and were given a place so that the people doing them could actually be supported through city policy, right? And so looking at a series of blue-green infrastructures, looking at cultivated and productive landscapes that allowed for new green neighborhoods to emerge in that city, really based on some of the agricultural and gardening initiatives already in place. And how is it that these kinds of landscapes could be thought of now as a legitimate form of urban development? This was quite a mind twister for the team. In a lot of ways, Tony Griffin was the architect and urban planner leading this effort. And I've got to say, through a lot of really deep conversation with her, she started out kind of looking at us a little funny, like, really, is this going to work? And essentially being one of the biggest advocates that we could concentrate more normative development in certain places and allow other parts of the city to begin to evolve. This kind of work actually emerged from some work that Jason did with some colleagues that resulted in this book, Stalking Detroit, is that right? Which, if you can get that book right now, it's like worth a lot of money. I keep mine at the office. I've got to get it out of the office before somebody takes it, right? But those were speculative projects by a group of academic colleagues, right? At very early moments that we were able to kind of build on and ultimately write new zoning code for through the work as a way to legitimize, again, some of the ways of life that were already operating on the ground. This work, these interests extended to more recent work that we took on in St. Louis. St. Louis, a city reckoning with its past, very much a racially divided city. Oftentimes here we were looking to the side or just off center to see things that are there and yet invisible, to question who space is designed for and who it's not designed for, and also to look at whose histories to amplify and to give value. This really is a city of white and black, investment in white areas, disinvestment in black areas. Mike was able to kind of really bring this out in that chapter. But in many ways, we were also searching for common ground across cultures. So how is it that things like food and music, that the earth beneath us, right, that certain levels of materiality, that culture and sports provided common grounds, common connectors that we could begin to build on? How is it that work like this could unearth hidden histories, buried histories, some of the harder histories of the city, and allow the development, in this case of a 20-mile greenway, to begin to highlight and expose those histories, expose some of those buried hydrologic and environmental histories, but also social histories, to give new life and give new value to the true diversity of people in a particular place. And how is it that we could amplify simple elements of black joy in the city? We had a great interaction with the Artists of Color Council, who really helped us brainstorm and think through the ways in which people use public space in St. Louis, what made for a welcoming and inclusive space, what made for something that did not feel welcoming. They too gave us certain hints on cultural traditions, talked very much about brick being a constant throughout the city, which eventually resulted in the new logo and the new name for the Greenway, the Brick Line. But also they started to talk about the importance of the stoop on the front of townhouses throughout the city, and how that created a place for social interaction between and among people that wasn't very common. And so those sorts of elements we began to script into and design into the project itself, so that our own version of a public stoop could be one of the furnishings, one of the identifiers for this project that started to weave its way through the city. We also worked with a broader team of artists to develop a set of thematics that would underpin a lot of the work. And the idea here was to use a greenway, a simple line, to start to connect these various islands of activity throughout the city, connecting people that don't talk to each other, connecting places where no connections currently exist. And so the greenway took many forms. We developed a kind of graphic identity system, which you see on the ground, and came along with a palette of materials, but was also important that it had manifestations in very different parts of the city, in many, many different kinds of places. And I'll just show you a couple of these in a little bit more detail. One really in ways that amplified certain cultural assets that were not on the city map, but were really important. This is the Griot Museum of Black History up in North St. Louis, a really important cultural institution that didn't get much play in the city, but really documented a lot of the importance of the So this project is how is it that we give that given context? How is it that Greenway how is it that we can begin to develop more intense social
We're getting a picture.
So in a lot of ways we're taking over
Oh, still a top.
across the street to bring people to them, making investments in We also, in some parts of the city that were pretty heavily devastated, began to think through a strategy of reinvigorating vacant lots with a toolkit, an array of strategies for how we might remake those over time, where our role was simply the facilitator, and the community's role would be deciding which of those lots took on which of the different kinds of activities over time. And so in this sense, our role is as much a curator as much as anything, allowing community input and community decision-making to produce a set of constantly evolving versions of what their city and urban fabric and neighborhood might be like. And in all of this, how can we also create opportunities for new kinds of open spaces, destination open spaces that would bring people in from across the city, that would offer, in this case, a new kind of landscape next to Forest Park, that would offer opportunities for interactive art and bridge a series of highway divides connecting different parts of the city to one another. This is an extraordinarily long and heavy video, but I'll just give you a few glimpses of it. Here we're working with, I was calling Marlon Brando, but it's not Marlon Brando, it's Marlon from Arkansas, Blackwell, the architect, on the bridge design. And the idea of having a series of infrastructural paths that may then wound their way through this new destination landscape, which is really conceived as a public art landscape where public art installations could begin to change over time and really invite people in. Also one of the ideas that we learned from the Artists of Color Council. You go through a whole series of different kinds of landscapes here and continue to wind your way up through this landscape, eventually to a place where you can then get over the highway down into So in this way, it's a project, again, where we're working as planner, designer, and curator, stage director, if you will, of forms and processes, all to be informed and cultivated by multiple publics over time. Just to wrap up, I think in all of this, as I reflect, the stages on which we work, the actors we engage with, are very much already in motion when we arrive. Our work begins many acts in, and our appearances are sometimes relatively short. You might think of our work as understanding the scripts and dialogues as they are playing themselves out, interacting with those on stage and the forces behind the scenes in ways that both respond to and shift what is at work, sometimes resetting the trajectory of the play in ways that reveals what is hidden and giving new voice to those who have been off stage. In all of this, the approach and the work recognizes and accommodates the everyday, the mundane. It amplifies the prosaic, the raw and the unrefined, the intimate and the momentary, all the time staging new futures to unfold of their own accord. Hopefully, too, fostering moments that are witty, that allow for the uncanny and for the truly wondrous. Thanks. Should we do questions? Questions, comments? Right back there. Yeah, thank you for looking out. Yeah. No, and part of our argument with clients is actually they need to invest in those processes in order to go deep, in order to be able to do these things. So oftentimes that happens with partners. So the Moakley Day project was like 8 different organizations working with the city. Each of them have different funding sources, can get little grants in order to do those sorts of things. And so often it's finding creative partnerships, and we can be part of that conversation and putting them together, and then our staff can be part of those efforts as well. But it does require intentionality, and it requires resources, right? And so that's part of the advocacy work that we do up front. Sometimes that comes later on. You know, you have to kind of meet people where they're at the beginning of a process, but there are ways to process people as well. You know, there are a number of people who say community process is one thing and you don't get good design out of that, and other people say, well, yeah, I'm only going to focus on the good design and, you know, not worry about the community process. We think that you can actually get great design out of community process in the way in which you calibrate it and choreograph it, right? How is it that you can draw out things that we don't know? That Artists of Color Council was absolutely essential in bringing forward certain elements of that city and questions of perception of open space that are just beyond my ability, because my lived experience is different than theirs, right? Absolutely essential in terms of how we think about design. But our obligation is then to give those communities the same level of attentiveness and the same level of good design thinking as any other community that we work with. So it's really important to consider that. This is something I'm trying to formulate and articulate a little bit better and more conceptually, but how is it that we design for multiple publics and that there's a real intention to that, intentionality to that. Uh-huh. Oh, brilliant. Good. We work well together. Here and then Jason. I've got one here, and then here, and then here. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so those artists were paid by the client to show up and be part of that, which is important, right? Valuing the work and time that they give. But we're having those same conversations with just members of the pub, with our clients, cities, and giving something back to members of the public for the time that they give. Part of the problem at Moakley Park was just getting, I mean, this was happening before, during, and after COVID. And you know, a lot of those families were focused on how to get their kids to school and how to get a meal on the table and eventually how to get a vaccine, not what's my park going to look like in 30 years, right? And so we adapted to that. We began to organize events that were outdoors, were interactive, that offered food cards or gift cards for people, and also had an ice cream truck and a vaccination clinic there, starting to address actual needs of people on the ground. The partner organization, Boston Harbor Now, we all very much heard concern with neighbors about needles and other things happening within the park. So Boston Harbor Now organized a series of park cleanups and invited people not from across the street from those harder hit communities, but used their broader citywide network to bring in volunteers from other places to help clean up the park. And folks across the street started seeing that people were caring for the park, which was really, really important, right? And then we began to think about, okay, how could the basic needs of these communities be served within the park itself? A lot right now. There's a lot of focus in cities on urban heat and shade in communities that don't have access to air conditioning and have more extreme public health issues. And so how is it that various parts of the park could be programmed and designed simply as cooling stations, outdoor cooling stations, you know, simple things, more water fountains for people to play and interact with, more conditioned spaces in interior buildings within the park, right, that could have multiple functions and could offer services in ways. And so on a number of different levels, we started to take very seriously the very basic need, like things that you don't normally think of in park design, started to become part of the way that park would be programmed and part of the way the process would play itself out. Jason.
Yeah, I was just reading the same spirit. I was going to ask you to what extent you're consciously concerned with or working on and changing for your practice cultural role of the landscape architect. I mean, it seems to me that the landscape urbanism moment, let's say, in the landscape architecture produced very particular kinds of practitioners.
Yep.
That play very particular cultural roles, but I don't think you're really talking about that. I mean, you referenced it here, obviously. You're talking now about community engagement, other models, simply of yourself as a professional. I just wonder, like, is that you and your colleague talked about, or is that just organically changing, morphing, and you're not so concerned where it's headed or where it's headed?
Yeah. No, there was a moment where we started these discussions within the office, and we kinds of projects and taking on different kinds of issues. Yes, we were within that group at the beginning of landscape urbanism, kind of thinking that through. Actually, that project has had a lot of successes. That's not me, that's the bigger project, right? The way in which landscape is now playing a very critical role across the world in cities, the way that landscape architects are starting to be leaders or have been being leaders of big urban projects. Big success there, right? And so for us, the question became, well, how is that project evolving? What are the other forces that are in play? How is it that our own work is evolving, right? And how does that, too, start to mark a different kind of cultural project? Is it an extension of the work that we were doing initially? I mean, climate change, I thought, was simply an extension of some of the dynamic processes that we were already dealing with. But the levels of complexity of other social issues, racial issues, economic issues, starts dimension. So, yeah, I think there is another cultural project there. I'll say I'm in the process of trying to articulate what that is, but I think it has a number of the elements that we've been looking at today. And frankly, I think the designer, as a potential policymaker, as definitely advocate, social reform advocate, is all part of that, part of the role that we're playing. I'm glad you're all looking out for the bottom line. Somebody's got it.
I'm kind of wondering throughout, really, I love the way you frame the relationship between ecology and social change. They're totally entwined together. And it feels like the third leg of the triangle is economic.
Yep.
Through work like this. And I was just kind of, you alluded to this a little bit in the answer to Sarah's question about the size of accumulating funding together and things like that, but it feels like the bigger the project is, the more capital it needs, et cetera. And it feels like that the one creative design output here is just creative and clever deployments of capital.
Yep.
And I wonder if you could talk about some of those.
Yeah. So capital, governance, partnerships, who has a role in these projects. With a lot of this goes back a little bit to the Public Works Practices article that I wrote very, very early on. Like, what are these other issues that we need to be embroiled in, right? Because if we're going to do work that's complex, that touches on all these different issues, we've got to have some level of understanding of some of the financial structures and political structures that we're dealing with as well. And so we're in the process not only of working, like on Moakley Park, working with the city, who's our client, and they have their own systems and channels and a lot of support and confidence in what they're doing, but we're constantly advocating with other foundations. I have a meeting in a couple weeks with a foundation to kind of pitch them on this project as being right at the center of everything that foundation is about, right? An intersection of climate issues, equity issues right within the city, and this project being a manifestation of that. So we bring in consultants to help us think those things through, but also do a little bit of work of trying to connect those dots ourselves. It's not all through us. We have partnerships that are kind of exploding around this. I have one diagram, I didn't show it today, of all the different at a local, state, and federal level, and also nonprofit level that are actively involved in the making and shaping of there are different dynamics. These are different networks. Cultivate those and inform those. But we do, I mean, even on very simple projects, we think very strategically. I think I came out interview once, we didn't get the project, and I said, the project, can you give us a little feedback? And they said, well, your work looks so expensive. And I laughed. I said, Milwaukee was about at $1 million. 50. And for us, there was an economic strategy built into that. It's like, how can we take for the buck out of simple terms, right? Ability for them to do their craft and a sense of place and an identity. And so whether it's working at that scale, competition simply because it had nothing to do with it. This is in Syracuse. And look, it's a multiple to the street. And you do touch every single that project. Your budget is square foot. 10 foot buys you asphalt and in the back of the room gasped audibly. That site was to do something else. The design was interesting. What you can get, and in that case. Go. That's nice. Yes. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. So, so I don't actually describe myself as coming from a landscape urbanism background. Sometimes I describe myself as a kid from New Bedford, right, who's just trying to make his way in the world, right? But yeah, no, I mean, I'm teaching a course right now, a seminar course, and we're in the section of the course on urbanism, geography, territory, infrastructure. We're reading Neil Brenner and some of his colleagues talk about a planetary urbanism, the fact that everything is ultimately connected, the idea that sites of extraction are very much urban, because if we're mining someplace and there are people and processes at work, right, that is an extended part of the city, right? And that those actions that are going on, those operations, are having social and environmental impact in those places, right? Becomes a responsibility of us, right? And so, yeah, on one level, I do see those things interconnected, and in fact, distinctions between urban, suburban, rural are becoming a little bit murkier as we go along. I do think, so on the one hand, I think one of our strengths and one of our focus areas really is on urban landscapes, right? I think we're good at that. We take it on. We embrace the city. We have a very distinct starting point from a lot of other firms that you will see. As you saw, my upbringing, my introduction to landscape was through those urban projects, not through horticulture, not through gardening. I don't know a lot of perennials. I don't know how to make grass grow in your backyard, right? I mean, we work with people who do, right? But on the other hand, the kinds of issues that are in play in other kinds of sites that aren't quite so urbanized as the ones are very much of interest. And we have started to kind of get into those territories. A couple examples did a planning project and a couple projects that are moving forward on the island of Nantucket, which is, for what it is, a very wealthy place, but a place that is very subject to climate change and has the money and resources to begin to test new ways of thinking about that. So we're working in those kinds of environments right now. We have some competition work in the Middle East for very large parks on the edge of cities, between that kind of urban edge and the desert, right? And how is it that you make park and park-like spaces in places like that with a set of conditions that don't have a lot of water and have different culture to it. And so it's it's not quite a national park kind of setting, but it's not your urban destination theme park either. And so we're getting into these other kinds of territories and beginning to look at what the manifestations of this kind of thinking might be. Sure. Thanks, everybody.